So this is going to be a very, very brief overview of the Apollo program, and hopefully we'll have opportunities in the future to go into some of the sort of aspects of the program in more depth. But for today, it's just going to be a very brief overview with a few little deep dives that focus on some of the women that contributed to the Apollo program. So here I'll start off. So to begin, I often like talking about the history of Apollo, dating it back to the 50s or even the 40s. But today I'll start at the decision President Kennedy made to send humans to the moon. So the Eisenhower administration, as well as the Kennedy administration near the beginning, discussed lunar exploration, but both found it far too expensive. Things changed for Kennedy, though, in the spring of 1961, after Yuri Gagarin successfully orbited the Earth, and he was a Soviet cosmonaut. It was seen as a huge blow to US prestige. The Soviet Union had launched the first satellite, and so this was yet another blow to US prestige. This was followed in quick succession by the Bay of Pigs, which was a CIA-supported backed coup of Cuba that failed. Kennedy was looking for something that would be highly impressive to the international public, that as you can see in the slide here that says that we could win. He found it important that the international perception of the United States was positive, and that other countries would align with the United States as opposed to the Soviet Union. In this Cold War context of 1961, the US and the Soviet Union were competing for global influence, and then spaceflight became one of the major ways that they decided to do this. And so Johnson spoke with a number of people from NASA and Department of Defense and others, and ended up recommending sending humans to the moon and returning them safely back to Earth as the goal. Kennedy became quite convinced. The United States sent Alan Shepard, who you can see here, on a brief suborbital spaceflight in May of 1961. It was 15 minutes long, really short. This was the entire experience the United States had in human spaceflight at that point. And then shortly after that, President Kennedy proposed Project Apollo. And to Kennedy, it was really a way to sway larger international public opinion, and it was really a foreign relations program for him primarily. And I can talk about that more later if anyone's interested in that aspect of it. So between 1961 and 1972, this is a brief overview, there were 11 crewed Apollo missions. 4 of those tested equipment. There were 6 lunar landing missions and 1 aborted mission, Apollo 13. The first lunar orbit happened in December 1968 with Apollo 8, and then the first lunar landing was July 1969. In total, the Apollo astronauts collected about 842 pounds of lunar material, lunar samples, and brought them back to Earth. And a point which I find relevant, no human has been more than 400 miles from Earth since 1972, which was the last Apollo mission, although that may change with the Artemis program. It was an extraordinarily ambitious program. You really can't understate how ambitious and bold this challenge the nation was. The moon is roughly 240,000 miles from Earth, and the program ended up costing about $25 billion at the time. Estimates today suggest that the entire lunar effort would be closer to the equivalent of $288 billion today. It's just a huge, huge expense. Over 4% of the federal budget by the mid-1960s, and hundreds of thousands of people participated in Apollo across the country. A huge percentage of them were contractors and subcontractors. Over 90% of people working on the program actually were contractors and subcontractors, with a smaller percentage coming from NASA. It also required a really significant amount of new capabilities and new hardware. So we had to learn how to do spacewalks and docking and rendezvous and long duration spaceflight, and all this had to be learned at a really, really fast pace. So one of the things that was developed was the Apollo spacecraft. This is a multi-part spacecraft, and it sat on top of the Saturn V rocket. I want to point out some of the elements here because we have parts of the Apollo spacecraft in our collection, and the command module is from Apollo 11's at HASI right now, so it's a great opportunity to see it. So the command module where the astronauts would sit, as you can see in this illustration, is near the top there, and that was their primary home during the mission. And it below it is the service module, and below that the lunar module, and I have more detailed slides of those. And so during the majority of the mission, the command module and service module flew as one, and the service module provided a lot of things that the command module needed. So the propulsion system, electrical power, oxygen supply, and the command module was a single spacecraft, primarily just at reentry. And the exterior of it is designed to help withstand the immense heat at reentry as it goes through the Earth's atmosphere. So the outside part of the command module is basically, can be described as a heat shield, and then the interior structure, which I'll describe in a second, is a pressurized core. Interior is about 210 cubic feet inside, so relatively small, like 3 phone booths. And this outer structure could withstand heat up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and it varies in thickness from about 1/2 inch to 2.5 inches. And it's made of stainless steel and with a honeycomb was filled with an ablative material that helped the spacecraft withstand the immense heat at reentry. Okay, and this is a shot of the interior, and this is a link to the website that has the high resolution 3D scan of the Columbia command module from the Apollo 11 mission. I highly recommend you all checking it out if you haven't already. This scan is also available as part of the augmented reality app that was mentioned earlier, so you can explore it that way too. And you can explore both the inside and the outside of Columbia, which is quite a treat. And this is the inside. And as I said, it's quite compact. You can see the seats, which are called couches, where the astronauts would have sat right below you in this image. And there are 5 windows and 2 hatches. And it was a pressurized shell, more or less, with a huge amount of switches, as you can see, with the control panel there, and not much space. They could have folded those couches and put them aside to allow a little bit more space within the command module. I should move along because I worry I'm taking up too much time with this part. So there's the Lunar Module, which is another part of the Apollo spacecraft, and this was used by the astronauts to land on the moon. This is a 2-part spacecraft in itself. And really, one of the great elements of it is it was uniquely designed to fly in space. And so you see other kinds of crafts would have to take into account things like traveling through the atmosphere. The Lunar Module didn't have to do that. It never had to return to Earth. And so it is designed to fly in the vacuum of space, really a true spacecraft in a sense. That's one of the innovative parts about it. So the astronauts would have landed on the moon with the entire 2-part spacecraft, done the moonwalk, and then gotten back into the top part of the spacecraft there, you can see, and then launched in the ascent stage, which is the top part, and rejoined the command module, which was orbiting the moon in space. And if anyone has questions about that process, I can go into more depth in the question and answer period. I wasn't sure how familiar you all might be with that. But here is a picture of the Lunar Module 2, which we have at the museum, and the downtown location and the milestones of Spaceflight Hall or Milestones Hall. And what's I think really important about this particular artifact is that this was designed to fly in space. It was going to be used for test flight in Earth orbit. it wasn't needed for that, so it was repurposed for Earth tests. And then eventually it came to the museum, and we have modified it to look as close as possible to the Lunar Module Eagle from Apollo 11. And so it can really recreate sort of what it would have looked like on the moon if you had been there. But it is a real spacecraft, if anyone asks, and it was designed to fly in space, even though it didn't actually end up flying in space. So as I mentioned, these were launched on top of the Saturn V rocket, the most massive rocket the world had seen. And it stood 363 feet tall, just absolutely huge, and a multi-stage rocket. The Apollo program had a huge impact on NASA. As I mentioned, the budget was extreme, and it required new centers, a lot of new personnel, and to meet this really tight deadline. And part of the new personnel included women. And so I'm going to shift over to focus a bit on that right now. And the women picture here are part of Mercury 13. They were interested in becoming astronauts during the Mercury program, the early stage of human spaceflight in the United States. They were able to pass rigorous physical tests and psychological tests, but they were ended up not being allowed to fly. The Soviet Union had a female cosmonaut that flew in 1963, but the United States would not fly a woman in space for 20 more years after that. So 1983 with Sally Ride, and she became the first American woman to fly in space then. But instead of focusing on astronauts and cosmonauts, I'm going to highlight the contribution of two women who were engineers and scientists. And so at this time, between 2 to 3% of technicians and engineers at NASA that were hired from 1958 to 1970, so this is the period, were women. So just 2 to 3%, quite small. And female scientists were even more rare. By 1964, NASA had only 146 women employed at professional grades of GS-12 or above. And this is at a time when there were 35,000 employees at NASA in total. And by 1973, it had 18% female employees, which versus the government average at the time, which was 34%. So still not even up to the government average. And of the 4,432 women working at NASA at this period, just 310 of them were in science and engineering. So one of the women that you may be familiar with, because she has gotten a lot of attention, especially during the Apollo 50th anniversary, is Margaret Hamilton, and she was the lead Apollo flight software designer. And so we have actually some of her artifacts related to her in the collection, in the archives in particular. So she's someone that I like to talk about. And she popularized the phrase software engineering, and this was a period of time when computer technology was really in its infancy, and the astronauts in the Apollo program had access to only 72 kilobytes of computer memory. To give you a sense of that scale, a 64 gigabyte cell phone carries almost 1 million more times more storage than that. And the programmers would use paper punch cards to feed information into room-sized computers with no screen interface. So it's a very different time. Here, Margaret Hamilton is pictured in one of the simulators, and she had loved math from a really early age, and she got a job at MIT writing software to predict weather. And at this time, the process was you'd write code on a large sheet of paper, and then a key punch operator would create holes in paper cards and then key the codes into the punch cards, and then they would print out sheets that would show the results of the guidance equation calculations. And if they looked good, then the code would be sent to Raytheon, where it was woven with copper wires and magnetic cores into a long rope of wire. And then the wire went through the core. When it went through the core, it represented a 1, and when it went around the core, it represented a 0. And so slightly different than we have today. So Margaret Hamilton was the first programmer hired for the Apollo program at MIT, the first and she became the head of the team at MIT's instrumentation lab, which was responsible for writing and testing the hardware for Apollo. She was also a working mother, and sometimes she brought her daughter to work with her. And there's a great story about her daughter going into this simulator and playing around and creating an error, which then taught Margaret Hamilton to look for a potential error. So her daughter entered within, I don't want to get into the story too much because we don't have too much time, but her daughter was playing with the DISCI unit, which she entered the wrong code. She entered a launch code mid-flight, and the simulator had a problem, and so it triggered a major error. And this taught the software designers that they had to figure out a solution in case the astronauts might do this in flight. They were told that the astronauts don't make mistakes, so this wouldn't happen, but it actually did end up happening. So it was very helpful that they had this experience ahead of time to prepare. So another artifact that we have related to Margaret Hamilton is these Lego figures. So there's a Lego figure based on her, and it's a series of women in space, women of NASA, and it also includes astronomer Nancy Roman, who was the first female chief of astronomy at NASA, and Sally Ride, who was the first American woman in space, who I mentioned, and then Mae Jemison, who was the first African-American woman in space. So this is a great addition to the collection as well. And you can see Margaret Hamilton there with her large stack of printouts. So the Apollo program, sometimes we like to break up the crewed missions into different sections. And so there are the dress rehearsal missions, which are this set here of 4, Apollo 7 through Apollo 10. And this was really a period where they were testing the spacecraft and their different capabilities. And so Apollo 7 tested the command and service module in Earth orbit. Apollo 8 tested it on a flight around the moon, the first orbital test, the first orbital flight around the moon in history. 9 tested the Lunar Module in Earth orbit. And then 10 was the dress rehearsal mission for the first lunar landing. And then you have the set of the first landings. These were relatively short. They proved that we were able to land on the moon. They collected some important lunar samples as well as data, but they were still relatively short missions in themselves. So that's why we grouped them together. And I'll talk briefly about Apollo 11 in particular, which is the first lunar landing mission in July of 1969. So this is the crew. Here you see them: Neil Armstrong, Mike Collins, Buzz Aldrin. They launched on July 16th, 1969, and traveled to the moon. Mike Collins stayed inside the command module while his colleagues, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, landed on the moon. And I'll mention that Mike Collins was director of the Air and Space Museum back in the 1970s when the museum first opened. After the astronauts landed on the moon and before they went out onto the lunar surface, they had a meal, and it was sort of a light snack more than a full meal. They would have a big meal once they returned back into the spacecraft. And this is a selection of some of the space food in our collection. But this is the menu that they would have eaten. So these are representative of what they had when they first landed on the moon. And this brings us to another story of a woman who contributed to Apollo that you might not have heard of. So Rita Rapp, she was an Apollo Food Systems technologist, and she was the head of the Apollo Food System team. And she ensured that the astronauts would be nourished and satisfied with their food choices, really worked carefully with them to make sure the things they liked would be part of their menus, but then also that they would have enough calories and enough vitamins and all the other things they needed to stay healthy in space. She was born in Ohio, and she earned degrees in science and anatomy. She was one of the first women to go to graduate school at St. Louis University in 1953. And she worked at first with the astronauts, testing them the sort of physical exams and things like that, so in biological experiments, before she moved to food. And during the early stages of human spaceflight, it wasn't clear what eating in space would be like if we were able to do it. So they had to have some early tests. This is a picture here of John Glenn. He was the first American to orbit the Earth, and for his Friendship 7 spacecraft. And he ate in space. And they had packed up for him applesauce and malted milk tablets and a beef and vegetable puree. And it wasn't in case he got hungry, because they really didn't worry about that on his short flight as much as they wanted to test to see whether or not he could swallow and accept food in microgravity. The early menus in Mercury and then the Gemini program and then Apollo were relatively simple and straightforward. By Apollo, they became a bit more complex, but it was really a process. They were learning a lot over time. One of the important introductions during the Apollo program, you can see it here. It allowed the astronauts to eat hot food in space, and so there's a water gun that would add hot water to the meals, and so that they wouldn't just have to eat cold food. So it helped recreate the experience of eating on Earth much more, which they appreciated. Here you can see Rita Rapp demonstrating that process. And as I mentioned, the meals were planned in consultation with Rapp and her colleagues, and they fit a set of nutritional guidelines. They usually had between 2,500 and 2,800 calories a day, and they were really careful to make sure that they had the right amount of calcium and protein, and they were packaged up, as you can see here. This is a day 3 meal pack. And Rapp continued to work for NASA after the Apollo program, from Skylab and the Space Shuttle programs. She was known and well loved for her cookies that many people enjoyed on Earth, and was given the NASA Exceptional Service Medal. So on the lunar surface, back to the lunar surface, I guess, Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong spent about 2.5 hours in total walking around on the lunar surface. By Apollo 17, which was the last Apollo mission, that mission spent 75 hours on the lunar surface. So a great difference, a huge increase in time. The Apollo 11 mission, they did a number of important symbolic gestures and sort of activities on the lunar surface, like raising the American flag, speaking to President Nixon, unveiling a plaque that represented that the mission was peaceful and for all humankind. And they also collected lunar samples and set out scientific experiments. Here's some examples of some of the tools they would have used. These are training tools, but examples of the type of instruments they used to collect lunar samples. In their spacesuits, it was difficult to move, and they had limited range, and so so NASA developed these special tools for collecting lunar material. Here's a picture of some of that collection on the lunar surface. They had these checklists on the arms of their spacesuits, which detailed the sample collection schedule for a mission, but they were also able to collect additional material that they saw that they thought might be interesting to collect. They were trained in geology. Some joke that they were trained so much in geology that it was equivalent to a master's degree. So they had some sense of what might be interesting to collect to bring back to Earth. Here's a picture of a collection bag. It's another artifact from our collection. The Apollo lunar sample return container, which was an aluminum box, and it had a triple seal, and it preserved the lunar material in a lunar-like vacuum, which was important. And then it could be opened at the Lunar Receiving Lab in Texas. You can see an image of that here, where some of the lunar samples are being studied. the Apollo 11 crew, when they returned to Earth, it was important to put them in quarantine. This is another artifact from the collection, a wonderful Airstream trailer that's been modified to ensure that the astronauts would be quarantined when they returned. And so they took a off-the-shelf Airstream and then modified it a bit. This was waiting for them on the aircraft carrier. When the astronauts splashed on the ocean, they were immediately transferred to this Airstream trailer. It has all the normal things that a vacation trailer would have, so beds and a little kitchen, had a microwave, but it was modified so that the air pressure would ensure that no air would escape. It was a lower air pressure inside. They took off the wheels so that it would be more stable, and had a special system, so when the astronauts showered, that water would be collected when an escape. And part of it was this fear that maybe there were some pathogens on the moon and the astronauts might bring them back to Earth, and it could be really problematic. So they put the astronauts in quarantine first in this Airstream trailer, and then this was transferred to Texas, and then they were put in quarantine in Texas in total for 3 weeks, just briefly here in this Airstream trailer, and the rest of the time in Texas. But this is a wonderful artifact out at Hazy, and I encourage you to take a look. When the astronauts returned from the moon, they were greeted by newspaper coverage and television coverage that they got to see of the first lunar landing. And Buzz Aldrin made a comment to Neil Armstrong after seeing all the coverage of all the people, millions and millions of people around the world watching the first lunar landing, that he said, we missed the whole thing because the experience on Earth of watching the first lunar landing was so significant and involved so many people. And it was something that they didn't get to experience. They had a very different experience walking on the moon. Okay. So, and then we have the final missions, we're called the J missions in the Apollo program. And these were much longer stays, and they had more elaborate scientific programs. Included the Lunar Rover that you can see a picture of here. The rover was able to, made the astronauts able to go farther afield from the Lunar Module, and so they could collect more samples. The duration of the stays were longer, so they were on the moon then for a number of days, and had a number of moonwalks. And one of the examples of some of the other science that was done on the moon, in addition to collecting lunar samples, was the Apollo Lunar Surface experiment package. There was a version of it for Apollo 11, sort of a smaller version, and then the later missions had much more elaborate versions of this. And so it included things like arranging retroreflector and seismic experiments and atmospheric composition experiments, so a variety of things. And the astronauts and the scientists they were working with were interested in learning more about the moon, so whether or not there were moonquakes, the getting a more precise understanding of the distance of the moon from the Earth. That's what the ranging retroreflector helped them do. So the experiments were used for a variety of objectives, but helped us learn a lot about the formation of our solar system and the moon in particular. So just wrapping up now, there are a number of long-term legacies. It could go on and on and on. From the Apollo program, here are a few. US public interest really waned after the first lunar landing, and even though international interest remained quite high throughout the program, and the United States was already spending a lot of money in fighting the Vietnam War, and there were a number of problems at home. And so there's a lot of critique of the expense of the Apollo program and whether or not it should be a national objective. President Nixon decided to shift the emphasis of the US space program at this period of time. And so it was decided to cancel the last few Apollo missions and pursue other types of programs, including the space shuttle program. As mentioned here, Apollo was a scientific success, although it was primarily proposed for diplomatic motivations during the Kennedy administration. It was also a scientific success as well, and that's an important part of the legacy of the program. and I'll also add one more thing, which I think is an important part of the legacy of Apollo and its meaning and significance. So the astronauts brought cameras with them into outer space, and they took some incredible photos that they brought back to Earth. This is the camera from one of the cameras from Apollo 17, and this camera took this image, which hopefully you've seen before. You probably have, because it's one of the most famous images ever taken. And many of the astronauts said when they went to the moon, the most important thing they discovered was the Earth and a new appreciation for Earth. And some said that they wish they could take all the world leaders into space and have them see the Earth from this perspective. And this is something that astronauts continue to say today, that this view from space of Earth creates a huge appreciation for the planet, the planet's environment, and then also for the need for peace and the sense that we all live just on one planet together. So we're part of one large community as opposed to our particular nations. And so this is one of the legacies of Apollo, is thinking about the Earth in this way, or talking about it, and then also having images like this image here of the blue marble that help us communicate that sense. So that's what I'll stop today, but I'm happy to answer questions that you have about the artifacts or about Apollo or anything else. And I'll minimize my screen now, or I'll stop sharing. Hopefully I can see you guys then.
Teasel, that was amazing. Thank you so much. There is a lot that I learned. In the chat, one of the questions was, how did they fit the rover, and how did they get that up to the moon to actually use the rover on the moon?
Yeah, so it was I had to describe it. I wish I had a diagram, because that would make it so much easier. Actually, it might be able to find one of my books here, but it was sort of embedded into the side of the lunar module. So if you remember that picture of the lunar module, it's these two parts. There's the top part and the bottom part. If you think of the bottom part, it was put into this sort of on the side of that. And once the astronauts landed on the moon in the lunar module, they released it sort of like a drawbridge function. The lunar rover was it was able to fold up really, really well. It was very small, it was very light, and the wheel sort of folded in. And so it was much more compact in flight than it looks in the pictures of when you see it on the moon.
That makes sense. Another question that we had was, there was a lot of materials for Apollo, and they stopped the Apollo program. What happened to the materials that they were going to use to explore with Apollo? Did they sort of put it into any other space programs? Does NASM have them? Would you happen to know what happened to the materials that would have enabled further Apollo missions?
Yes, it's a combination. That answers her. There was some follow-on programs. So the Apollo Applications Program. So the Skylab program, which is the first American space station, used hardware from the Apollo program, in particular stage of the Saturn rocket, and then command modules as well. And so you can see, you go to the downtown location of the museum, you can see the backup module for Skylab there and learn more about that. So Skylab hosted 3 different crews of 3 men each in the early 70s. And then some of the Apollo hardware was also used for the Apollo-Soyuz test project, which was a mission that involved both American astronauts and Soviet cosmonauts. And it was in 1975, July 1975. And the 2 crews trained with each other. And then the Soviet cosmonauts launched from the Soviet Union, and then the Americans launched from Florida, and then they joined each other in space, and it's known as the handshake in space, and it was seen as a symbolic representation of détente, so a sort of a reflection of a thawing of the Cold War and this interest in having a renewed, improved relationship between the US and Soviet Union. It didn't lead to too much in the immediate, sort of like after 1975, the Soviet Union and the United States, politically, détente didn't last that long. especially with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Anyways, this is probably a longer answer than you want of this particular question, but some of that Apollo hardware then became important to Skylab and Apollo-Soyuz test project. And then some of it also became part of the museum's collection, and you can see Saturn V rocket if you go to Florida, for instance. You go to Kennedy Space Center and see it there. So there was one that wasn't used, and you can see it on display.
So as a history teacher, I'm just really in heaven right now. But there were two questions specific to the collection. Are there any spoilers for the new artifacts in terms of the new Apollo gallery that we might be able to have you sort of share with us? And then the other one is that visitors ask a lot where all the discarded pieces might have gone. Were there any recovered that are now currently on display at NASM or other museums, which you sort of touched on a little bit, but if you could expound upon any spoilers, and what about discarded Apollo hardware?
Do a combo answer to those questions. So one of the things are a set of artifacts that will be really exciting to have in the new Destination Moon exhibit, which were not part of the old Apollo to the Moon exhibit, were pieces of the F1 engine from the Apollo 11 mission that were recovered from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean floor. So these are really exciting addition to have to the museum. The Saturn V was a multi-stage rocket. The F1 engines, after the Apollo Saturn V launched the astronauts into space, this was one of the stages that was discarded and went to the bottom of the ocean and was left there for decades and decades and decades until Jeff Bezos funded this expedition to retrieve them, and he was able to find components from Apollo 11 and Apollo 12, and we're going to have some of those components from Apollo 11 in the new exhibit.
Very cool. Another question was, what are your thoughts about the challenges of a lunar takeoff? Because it's pretty interesting, the engineering problem. What I've learned from talking to you is that it is really one of the most incredible engineering feats for the whole program. But how was it to actually leave the moon to reconnect with the other astronaut?
Mm-hmm. Well, some of the differences with the moon is you have 1/6 the Earth's gravity, and then you have next to no atmosphere, or basically zero atmosphere. So so it's very different than launching from the Earth, for instance. So you don't have to deal with as much gravitational force, but you can't rely on the lift that you would in Earth from the atmosphere. That's not really the case with launching from a rocket, but like an airplane might deal with lift. So those are different factors. With any type of launch, weight is a huge factor, and they had to ensure that they had enough fuel, and then they also had to ensure that they were able to meet up with the command module, which was orbiting overhead with Mike Collins. So those are all issues they had to consider.
Excellent. One thing that I sort of wanted your take on was, what is the actual surface of the moon? Like walking around as an astronaut on the moon, what would they be experiencing? Because the Discovery Station that we have it's not quite visceral, but we want to make them feel a little bit more of it. Again, they're doing that through like virtual reality and augmented reality. So are there is there a way that we can set the scene a little bit better for the visitors as they experience the Discovery Station?
Sure. It was covered in a very, very fine dust, powdery dust that really clung to the spacesuits. The spacesuits themselves really would have limited the type of sort of sensory experience. So the astronauts could sense that this was very, very fine dust. They were able to observe that when they walked, but the suits themselves would have prevented the astronauts from sort of feeling the surface, right? And even smelling it or anything like that until they were back inside the lunar module. the suits restricted them quite a bit. So there, as I mentioned, there's 1/6 of Earth's gravity, and so moving around on the lunar surface was affected by that and sort of and the pressurized spacesuits. And so just taking normal steps wouldn't have been so easy actually, and it wouldn't have been as good for balance. And so they did this thing they call the bunny hop. And so it's a little, it helped it helped them move around on the lunar surface, but they had to sort of adapt to how they moved based on these factors. But the layer of dust, that sort of fine soil, wasn't terribly deep, and you can see that. It's actually really fun to look at the images taken from the lunar surface. You get a sense of the depth of that.
Cool. Another question was about spin-offs. Is there any technology that started an Apollo mission from the Saturn V perspective that is still used and being researched at this point? Is there any sort of application? Oh, I just
spin-offs. Yeah, there are a lot of different ways to think about spin-offs of this program, and often is the one that people will point to the most is the impact on the computer industry. And the way they talk about it is, before Apollo, computers were very, very large and getting larger and larger and larger. And the needs of spaceflight required that computers had to get smaller. And so, and this is a major shift, and the immense R&D investment in computers at this time really helped seed the computer industry that has become so important to us today and allows us to have these virtual experiences and a variety of other things. So that's one of the major spin-offs. Sometimes people even use that as a way to talk about some of the value of Apollo. There are lots of smaller examples. NASA actually maintains a website that lists all the technological spin-offs from the space program. I like to personally also focus on the political spin-offs. I think that the Apollo program, there was a lot of ways to interpret spin-offs or products or impact of Apollo, and it became a really important program in American diplomacy, and the Nixon administration used it to help improve relations with China. And this was one of the sort of the keys to the most important parts of the Nixon administration's foreign relations successes, was the thawing of relations with China, and the Apollo 11 program helped in that process. It's a longer story, but I'll just say that after the first lunar landing mission, Nixon met the astronauts and then went on a diplomatic tour of Southeast Asia and to Romania, and he called it Moonglow, and it was very explicitly planned to use the popularity of spaceflight to advance his agenda, both to introduce the Nixon Doctrine for the first time ever on that trip, as well as to find ways to improve relations with China, and then also find an end to the Vietnam War. So Apollo is, the technological spin-offs are really important, but there are many other types of spin-offs as well.
And then we just sort of had a comment about the spacesuits. It seems like the technology is still pretty similar. Can you comment on the spacesuits that were used for Apollo and maybe how they compare to something that we would use today?
Sure. I can only say so much about the spacesuits. Spacesuits are not part of my collection. We have a curator who focuses on the spacesuits in particular because they are so complex and they require such extensive sort of detailed conservation efforts. So I highly recommend speaking to Kathy Lewis if you have questions about spacesuits. The Apollo spacesuits, there are very many layers, over 20 layers. The first part, the closest to your body, would have been like long underwear or something like that, and then they had a suit that was the liquid cooling garment that had tubes sewn throughout it that would have water that would help keep the astronauts' temperature cool, keep them cool, or keep them at a nice temperature. And then there were many then it was like a pressure suit basically. And then after that, many, many layers of material that would protect them from solar radiation and all the dangers of existing within a vacuum in outer space. So there are many similarities today in some of the modern spacesuits and things we've learned, but improvements have been made in terms of flexibility in the gloves. There are some differences also with the suits that were used for lunar exploration versus suits that are used for EVAs that don't involve lunar exploration. And I unfortunately can't get into all those details about spacesuits because I don't focus on those very much.
Oh, no, no worries. We have an actual whole seminar with Kathy. So it's just interesting. They're very similar. But we are curious about your thoughts specific to the Artemis program because, you know, our return to the moon. Do you have any musings on what that might mean?
It's a really another bold, ambitious program, although we have decades and decades of experience now under our belt. The Artemis program, I think it's interesting how it is named after the sister of Apollo, and one of the things that they're emphasizing is that it'll include a woman in addition to a man. I mean, it'll be more than two people, but it'll be both men and women. One of the ways it's framed differently is that during Apollo, they talk about how it was flags and footprints that we left on the moon, and now we're going there to stay. So it's the expectation is it'll be longer duration. One of the things that's important to remember with any kind of large scale, especially human spaceflight project that's extraordinarily expensive, is it requires a whole lot of political will, perhaps more than anything else. And it can be very, very difficult to sustain that political will from different presidential administrations. And so after the Apollo program, there are actually two other times where presidents initiated lunar exploration programs. So both George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush. But what happened, which so often happens within space, is when there were new administrations, the plans changed. And so one of the things that's really difficult is to do a large scale program that takes many years and to sustain it through multiple administrations. And so what we saw is after George W. Bush emphasis on the moon, the Obama administration switched it to asteroids, and then now the Trump administration is focused on the moon, and whether or not that can be accomplished in another 4 years or a different, depending on who is elected, you know, that might change. And so I think that's one of the things to think about when we think about a program like Artemis is these very expensive, very public programs are often very tied to politics. And so we'll see what happens, but it's more vulnerable because of that.
And you're so well versed on Apollo because you're the Apollo curator. What sort of sparked your interest in delving so deep into this history?
So I was really interested in the history of science diplomacy and space diplomacy. And when I was doing research on this project, so the beginning of the space age, it started as part of the International Geophysical Year, which was this massive global cooperative effort to study the Earth. And it happened between 1957 and 58 when there's most activity on the sun. And so it was seen as a great opportunity to study the Earth's atmosphere and to study Antarctica. And the early satellites were launched as part of this program, involved 67 nations, and it was a big cooperative program. They were sharing data. I was studying that, really interested in that. The Smithsonian was involved in that, and that's part of what got me into it. And from that, I started learning about the role of space within diplomacy, and then came across material related to the role of human spaceflight, or the Mercury program, and then eventually Apollo within U.S. diplomacy, including the exhibits of spacecraft abroad, the astronauts traveling the world, and I gained appreciation for how much interest there was in these programs. People would wait in line 5 hours or 8 hours to see these spacecraft in person at this moment in time, and what that meant in terms of U.S. foreign relations. So that's what got me into Apollo initially. I think.
Okay, Jill, I'm not sure where Jen went, so I'm going to take over.
I apologize, my internet just dropped for a second. So I'm like, no, I cannot miss this webinar. But I did get to hear a little bit of it, and Augustine very fortunately let me back in. In terms of SpaceX or Blue Origin, do you have any comments about commercial spaceflight to take us to the moon?
Yeah, well, so sending humans to the moon is extremely costly even today. And so it will be really difficult, a huge challenge for private space industry to do it on its own. It's hard to see how it will be profitable anytime soon. And so there's been an important relationship between national space programs and private industry from the very start. As I mentioned, with the Apollo program, over 90% of people working on Apollo were contractors and subcontractors. So there was a really essential relationship between NASA and industry throughout that history. It's changed today somewhat, and one of the things that has been important is with SpaceX, for instance, been able to reduce the cost of launch, which is really going to be essential to any future exploration, because it's such a costly endeavor. But a large-scale human spaceflight program most likely will require the investment and interest of national governments, whether it's the United States alone or the United States working with other countries around the world. And so I think SpaceX and Blue Origins and other private industry are going to be part of this process in the ways that they have been before. Some of that relationship has changed a bit, and perhaps they'll have a greater role. But it's a really symbiotic relationship. NASA has been very, very important to the development of a company like SpaceX because it's provided so much capital for the R&D that was necessary for things like the Falcon 9. So it'll be exciting to see what happens going forward. There have been many positive things about these new relationships.
And Teasel has been really wonderful in helping us make our Discovery Stations. She has experience because she has even worked on one herself. Is there anything that you would give as advice to the facilitators of Discovery Stations? What is it that you think that people should sort of walk away from if they go to an Apollo Discovery Station?
I think one of the things that would be important is an appreciation for the complexity and ambition of Apollo, that it required so many people and the development of so many different components working together, that it was extremely bold, how challenging it is to get to the moon, the moon, how far away it is, what that means, what it meant to undertake that type of challenge at that point in history. We had such limited experience, I think. So an appreciation for that, the boldness and that commitment and the sensibility that was a part of Apollo. I think one of Apollo's great legacies is this idea that you set a challenge and you accomplish it, and you work together to achieve a goal. Even when you set that goal, you might not know how you're going to achieve it, but that's important to set really high goals and pursue them. So I think that is one of the important messages from Apollo, and it can be communicated in part through a nice deep dive in understanding all the different things that had to be developed to make Apollo possible, and all the people that had to contribute to the program to make it work.
Excellent. That actually, I think that this is my highlight of the whole week. Thank you so much for coming to the webinar and presenting and making us much more knowledgeable of both how we have the artifacts in the museum and what the program was in general. With that, we're actually going to conclude this webinar, and we thank Teasel again. I'm going to ask everybody, I don't know that I'll be able to stay on because I'm having internet problems, but everybody can turn their camera on and wave to Teasel. And again, thank you so much for coming and doing this webinar. It was wonderful. Thanks, Teasel.
Having me.
Bye, guys.
Thank you so much.